Oh, now it's probably working. Is that right? Somebody type and say that they can see me now. All right, great. Thank you. So they changed the way that, since I did these last year, they changed a little bit about how YouTube Live works. And so it used to be I would just hit the button on my streaming software on my desktop and it would just start streaming. And apparently now I have to hit another button that I didn't notice because that says go live. So thanks, because I just went on for several minutes. I started right on time. And thank you, Pavel, for asking that question of will there be a live Carto session soon? Because I was like, wait a minute, I'm doing one right now. So, well, I had several minutes of rehearsal, so that was good. So actually, I'll switch back to the scene. Great. So thanks for joining me today. I get nervous being on video, but the fact that I now interact with all other human beings via video in this day and age of social distancing has made this process a little bit easier. So thanks for taking the time to join me on what could be a potential second season of live cartography. I did several of these videos last year. I kind of always meant to get back around to doing these things, but I sort of never had the time, or I was feeling sick in the winter, colds and things like that. And so this seems like a good time to get back to it, especially because it's a nice way for me to feel a little bit more connected to the community, because there are people here live. I could do these as pre-recorded YouTube videos and they would probably be better edited and, look nicer, and I would not, hum and haw all the time and say but it's nice to know that there are people there. So thank you for using the chat, and feel free to ask questions, make comments, let me know if anything is going wrong suddenly with the stream, and just say hi to all these other people who are sharing this experience with you. We're all sort of coming together for a little bit. And today we're going to talk about a map style that I've been playing around with lately. So if I switch back to here, if you poke around in my portfolio at somethingaboutmaps.com, I put up a bunch of maps that are in a sort of old book looking style that I sort of became enamored with last month or several weeks ago, and I played around with making a few different maps in this style. And I got some ones of parts of the Midwest, and we'll come to the subject matter in a little bit. Got some Alaska, got the path of a book through the Midwest here, and they all have this sort of old look. And I wanted to sort of emulate, what if you pulled something down from the shelf of a library, it's dated to 1937 or whatever, what might that look like? And one of the first things I kind of had to do as I started this was think about, well, what makes something look old? And this is a question that a lot of you have probably had to ask yourselves as well, and other cartographers out there have at the same time, because I've seen plenty of you making maps that look like they're from a different time period. Maybe it's the 1880s, 1920s, or what have you. And the questions we need to start with are breaking down what are the components of the visual style that we can copy to make things look like they're not our sort of standard modern digital map. Because we often make these things to stand out, either because it's a fun break from the kind of thing that we're used to doing all the time, or because we're working for somebody who wants a map that looks different, looks unusual, and pops out, and old styles are a great way to do that. The biggest thing that can make these maps look a little different are these little colored dots here, which are called halftones. And that's the biggest chunk of what we're going to be talking about today, and that's why I titled this Fun with Halftones in the stream title. Halftones are a color printing process. They're little dots of color that we use to print things on paper. And some of you are pretty familiar with this if you work with print cartography. Some of you might not be if you're mostly working on things on the web. But I'm just going to refer you primarily for a lot of the details to Wikipedia. But basically, if you want to reproduce a color image, pretty much the most common way to do it is to put little dots of varying size of cyan, yellow, magenta, and black / key. That's what the K actually stands for in CMYK. Won't get into that. Cyan, magenta, and key ink on the paper. So if you have some small dots and you step way back, they're going to look light. If you use big dots, they're going to look like dark gray. And if you, eventually add them together, just stealing Wikipedia's great example images here, you can make various colors out of these things. And in fact, if you look behind me here, I've got printing plates from the 4th Atlas of Design nailed on the wall behind me. And you can't see them all too well from my camera, so I'll just pull up an example image here. Whoop, I didn't want to add that into here. Oh well. We'll roll with it. I've got 4 of these plates, and I'm not sure the technical details of why they all look blue, but they're for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink, and we kind of can divide our image out into these 4 channels. So I can see there's text, for example, over here. That's in the black channel. We print the text in the book with black ink, and so there's big empty spaces over here on the cyan plate, or the magenta plate, or the yellow plate, where that text would otherwise have gone. So that's kind of the very, very brief overview of halftones, and we'll come back to that in more detail later. But the thing I want to point out is that halftones, while they're a big part of the style that I'm using to make things look older, they're not sufficient by themselves. And I want to... Oh, sorry, I didn't... I showed you an image, but I had not switched over to... it. So there we go. This is what I was talking about. So there's black here, no black over there, right? There's no black over there. Just the different channels that we're printing with. So I get these little scenes in my stream set up so you can switch from my desktop to my camera, etc. So we'll come back to that though. In the meanwhile though, halftones are not enough. So this is a map I made a couple months ago for a client. It's sort of it's modern, uses digital software, all that sort of thing. It's not designed to look old by any means. But if I take a few minutes and halftone it, I just did this earlier in Photoshop, and I zoom in and make it out to little dots, that's not enough to make this thing look older. Right? To me, it looks kind of like, well, it's made, maybe it's printed in a magazine of some variety, but fairly modern. It definitely has that printed on paper look because of the halftones, but there are more components to the style to making things look older. So that's what we need to think about. This, on the other hand, is a version of the map that I did make to try and emulate this 1930s, 1940s look. And so there's some other components besides the halftones going on here, and the biggest one that stands out to me is the line work. It's very simplified. It's, sort of wobbly and smooth and highly generalized versus, this one here. This is, off-the-shelf natural earth data for the coastline, for the rivers, etc. And there are ways that you can get this effect done sort of through generalization in GIS or what have you, or going into map shaper or the like, but I find the best thing to do is just to trace it by hand. And the reason is because it's not that very accurate coastlines, very highly detailed coastlines didn't exist in decades ago or a century ago. You can look at old topographic maps from the 1880s, and there's a lot of detailed survey data going on in those things. But these sort of very highly detailed maps, in my understanding, in my thinking about it, and these things are sometimes just speculation, so you can correct me if I might be missing something, but these were efforts of government agencies or road atlas companies or state transportation departments. On the other hand, if you were pulling a sort of popular book off a shelf, the odds are there's going to be just hand-drawn information in there. If you look at old newspapers too, I've looked at maps from the New York Times from the 1920s, and things definitely were drawn by hand by somebody who is clearly just kind of looking at a map over to the side, maybe something from National Geographic or the federal government, and they're just, they're drawing as on their paper to make that kind of thing. So I think a handmade look is an important part of this. And as I said, there's ways to do this digitally and smoothing filters and such, and generalization filters in GIS, but hand drawing it is actually pretty quick. I literally made this in this line work in 10 or 15 minutes by taking my sort of finished detailed map and just pulling an Illustrator and just tracing right over this real quick. And the more detail you want, the longer that's going to take, but it's quicker than you would think to make something like this as far as getting the line work going. And of course, if you don't have time and you really want something that looks hand-drawn right away, then some of you know where I'm going there. I'll refer you to Project Linework at projectlinework.org, which is a library of handcrafted vector line work. And some of these things are, stylized very angularly. They're maybe not sort of the most, smooth hand-drawn look, but some of them, on the other hand, were drawn sort of in this loose, simple hand style. So, this one's very popular, Moriarty hand. Dylan Moriarty drew this, and we've got countries for the whole world, coastlines, rivers, etc. This is one that you can download. I actually traced this out of an old New York Times map. And you can kind of see it's not, it looks kind of like what you might expect, but there's some sort of loose, simplified things based on what that artist was drawing at the time in their graphics department. So these things are all available to you, and they come in, shape files and GeoJSON files and just Illustrator files and SVGs if you want to open them straight in graphics software. So feel free to make use of these kind of things in projects where you want things to have that hand-drawn look. So that's one component that goes into making something look a little bit older. The line work here, for example, I pulled this straight out of Project Linework. Used Elmer Casual by my colleague Marty Elmer. He drew all the states, parts of Canada, all ready for use. So it saved me a little bit of time. The second thing that stands out to me as being important is the typography. Thinking about what typefaces would be appropriate to see in that time period. There's obviously different aesthetic movements going on concurrently at any given time, just like today. Different people like different styles, but one of the things that really appeals to me about the interwar period is Art Deco, and I really like typefaces that kind of fit in the geometric sans serif category. So they have a real classic example of that, and one that I'm using in all of these maps, I think, is Futura. So if I look up here, and if I want to know what's about the history of a typeface or whether or not it's right for map project, I often look it up on Wikipedia, learn a little bit more about it. Released 1927, right? So this is period appropriate. You can learn more about its characteristics, its geometric sans, and you kind of dive right into this and build up your knowledge base about what typefaces might be useful for. And one thing that I do sometimes and recommend is thinking about, going to Google and saying, like, what fonts of the 1890s or something like that. Pick a time period and look at examples of things. And I'm not surprised this takes me to a really useful site that I've used before. Fonts in Use is a really great library of people just uploading, brochures, books, maps, whatever, and saying, here's the typefaces people used. And I can look at here's ones people have tagged with the 1890s, and I can see, well, okay, this Holloway's Traveling Theater uses a very large number of typefaces, but I can see what some of these ones, might have been popular at these in these different time periods. So highly recommended, and you can search for different types of materials. I can look at maps. I can look for different time periods. So doing a little research to know what might be useful in that time period. I also, on these maps, besides picking Futura, because I happen to like it, I know it fits in this style, generally kept all of my labels straight, right, just on horizontal lines. And that was me primarily speculating that, it's certainly going to be easier if you were doing typesetting in graphics back then to have labels that are on straight, simple lines versus, my map styles tend to rely a lot on very curved labels, so this is a little bit of a change of pace for me. If I back up here to like other things in my portfolio, some of which I've shown in past live streams, I mean, just curved, swooping labels just everywhere. But that's, that would have been a lot harder to do. Certainly not impossible. You can find old maps with curving labels. But I decided it might fit in a little bit more with this style to keep things straight. The last thing before we get to halftones is kind of related to it, and that's thinking about color. So I'm just going to pull up in Illustrator here this map that we were just looking at in my portfolio, and here's the original Illustrator file for it. And one of the things that's valuable to think about are the colors that you're building your image out of. So I usually keep, because I'm just used to it, I usually keep Illustrator in CMYK color mode. If you go to the document color mode, run things in RGB or CMYK colors. I do a lot of print cartography, so this is how I think. But if you're not used to it, this is a good mode to be in and to start to think of your colors as being constructed from these cyan, yellow, magenta, and black inks. Because one of the things that people would often try and do, and still to a degree, it's the kind of thing that even modern print cartographers think about, is building individual colors on your map out of as few inks as possible. So if I go on my layers here, let's see what I got. Select my water bodies. This is 30% cyan ink, 15% black. There's no magenta, no yellow in this. Right, these sort of park overlays here, little magenta, little black. The labels, no cyan, no magenta, no yellow, just black. And the reason for that is that when you think about printing in CMYK, if you go to a commercial offset press, and offset is a technique that has been used for many, many decades, and is what gives that sort of halftone look that we're going to try and emulate. What they do is they're using these plates behind me. These are actual plates from printing a book, and they're basically going to stamp the paper with some cyan ink, some yellow, some magenta, and some black. And one of the potential things that can go wrong, and it's not as big of a problem as it used to be in earlier days, is that the plates might be slightly misaligned, and you might stamp the yellow ink just a few fractions of a millimeter over from where it should have gone. And so that leads to registration errors. And I actually have a simulated version of one of these, of these in the document. You can see here on these little trees, there's a little yellow halo coming up from the side, and there's a blue halo on the bottom, because these have blue and yellow, and I just sort of simulated what if somebody, when they loaded the plate, this is physical, mechanical stuff, trying to lock these large plates down perfectly to just fractions of a millimeter, you might miss slightly. Or down here, same thing, I tried to simulate. I don't know if you can see there's a little bit of a yellow band down here because they just didn't line up. Or you can even see some banding up here. So it was a thing that happened, and you just kind of had to be ready for it. And if you have fewer inks being stamped on top of each other, this problem is going to be less of a problem. There's less to go wrong if you're only stamping 2 inks on top of each other to make the lakes, for example, versus if you have to get all 4 perfectly lined up. So there's this mindset of, well, how do I build this out of as few colors as possible? So that kind of informed how I designed this. And this is also something that would have been more of a problem in things that were printed quickly and cheaply, like newspapers and magazines. If you have, if you're putting more time and effort and money into printing, registration errors wouldn't necessarily be as big of a problem. And nowadays, printers get better and better at lining things up pretty well, so it's not as huge of a deal. But back then, that was definitely a major thing, sort of informing color palettes, is my understanding of it. It's important to design things, therefore, in CMYK mode, and part of that has to do with the way that Illustrator converts between colors. Right now I've got this 30% cyan, 15% black. If I were doing this in document color mode RGB, a lot of you are used to working in RGB colors, and the colors look the same. I can specify this blue as some amount of red, green, and blue light. It'd be how we would specify colors for the web as well. But when Illustrator tries to take these RGB numbers and convert your map into CMYK plates, it doesn't necessarily arrive at what I originally had. Looks like it's going to try and build this same blue color out of 40% cyan, throw in some magenta and some yellow. And this gets at the idea that you can make the same color through mixing different amounts of inks. And because instead of using black ink in here, I could have used some magenta and yellow together and a little bit more cyan. That would kind of filled in the equivalent of the darkening that the black did. So there's multiple potential conversions between RGB and CMYK, and this wasn't the best, most efficient one that used the fewest number of CMYK colors. So it's important to sort of design this. Just kind of undo myself back here. There we go. Back to CMYK mode. So it's important to kind of keep this in mind when designing and do this directly in CMYK mode. The only other thing I want to add about sort of the design is that, in particular, I was very inspired by something called isotype, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's and it's even in here, various isotype halftones in my portfolio. I'm kind of pointing that as my inspiration. Isotype, look for isotype maps, for example, here. It was the International System of Typographic Education, and it was a style of showing statistical graphics, infoviz, as we would say nowadays. There were map components, but there were other things besides. Look at isotype dataviz, for example. They would tend to use little repeating icons to show amounts of things. So this is kind of like the equivalent of a bar graph, except you can count the number of people in it. And, in each case, it looks like home and factory weaving. Blue symbols represent 50 million pounds of production for the weaving, and then you can see who works at homes or factories over time. But they also did, maps during this time period as well. So if I go back to the isotype maps, also I am going to say that I typed dataviz with an S, and it's showing results for dataviz with a Z. So I don't know, is that what people say now? Are we trendy with our Z at the end? So this is the kind of stuff I kind of kept in mind as I was designing this. And if you're ever looking for these icons that were sort of popular in this 1920s, 1930s, 1940s movement of isotype, because it's very much about the icon design and showing little pictures, because the idea was if we do our pictures really well, no one needs any words or very few words on our maps and graphics. There is an isotype symbol library that you can actually go and get. People have scanned a lot of different images from these books and designs. There's the Gerd Arndt's archive. Because this person, Gerd Arndt's, not sure how to specifically pronounce that, he was a designer who worked with the founders of isotype, Otto and Marie Norath, and he worked to design a lot of these different icons for different situations. And so, I can just go through his web archive and pull up dozens and dozens of icons for different situations. I didn't use one in specific in this map here. I drew my own little trees. But in one of these here, this one, these trees, I just pulled that straight from their library, and these are raster images, so I just auto-traced it in Illustrator real quick and converted it to the color that I wanted, because he just had a simple black image that was scanned in. Also, in case you're wondering what this map is about and why does this say quality, worthwhile, this is the sort of central east side of Madison where I live, and these are the trees that I climbed last year, because I'm somewhat avid climber of trees. It's one of my only forms of exercise, and I have a little ranking system because last year I decided to start recording the coordinates of every tree that I climbed, and whether it was a really high quality tree or whether it was just kind of unremarkable. And some trees I was climbing up to pick fruit, things like apples and such, from or service berries instead, so I wasn't really climbing it for fun. And this, I'd long been thinking about how do I map these data? What's something interesting to do with it? And this style kind of gave me an excuse for going down that path. So those are the pieces, besides sort of simulating the texture of the printing. We've got our simplified line work, and in this case I just drew the lakes. I kind of traced it off OpenStreetMap data. I had some vector things that I started in GIS and then I redrew it by hand. I've got my color palette, I've got my typography, and in this case I specifically wanted sort of some nice simplified solid color icons that I thought fit in to a design movement that I really liked from that time period. With that, I'm ready to put the halftones in, and so I need to export this thing over into Photoshop. So I'm going to go to File, Export, and Export As. And I'm going to go to my desktop here. It's down. Yeah, and I'm just going to say here, close in Final, use my artboards, export, and I want to do CMYK export. I'm going to do it at high resolution here. Things are going to be detailed because it's all going to be rasterized. And I want to write my layers and keep my text editable in case I ever felt like I needed to change something later. In this case, probably won't, but if you want that flexibility, it's nice to have. And it usually warns me that, well, I can't show everything as its own individual layer, collapse down some things, and that's fine. And turns out I already previously had exported this while I was going through making sure some things looked right. And I'm just going to overwrite that. So now let me pull this up in Photoshop here. All right, so here is my former Illustrator file in Photoshop. So you can see, zoom in, it's been rasterized and the type's been hinted and things like that. And it's made of a few different layers here. Got my dotted lines, my type layer, my trees, and everything else kind of got lumped into one, and that's fine. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much, but we will talk about some reasons that it might be useful to have your type separated in a little bit. The simplest way to make halftones in Photoshop is actually there's just a filter built in. And so first I'm going to show you the easy way. I'm going to select my clipped layer here, and I'm going to go to Filter, Pixelate, Color Halftone. And I'm just going to plug a number in here for a second, because I believe the default is 8, so I want to show you where it starts as the default. And I'm going to hit OK. And it turned the layer that I selected, in this case my background, into a bunch of color dots. And if I zoom in here, well, I've got remember my lakes were made of black and cyan ink, and that's what I see here. And, my park areas were made of some black and magenta and so on. And if I zoom way out, yeah, it looks kind of printed. The dots are way too big, so I got to zoom out to even get that kind of textured effect. But, see, it's starting to get kind of where we need to. I'm going to undo that. And you notice it only worked on my active layers, so what I'm going to do actually first is flatten my image, so now it works on everything. Just one layer everything has been compressed into. If I do this again, in color halftone, I can lower the radius. I can make the dots smaller, a little bit finer, because that was clearly way too big. Ideally, I'd like to type in 1, but it will warn you, hey, you can only have 4 as your minimum. And that's still way too big, right? It's way too coarse. So that's a little unfortunate. And, I zoom out, it's getting a little better. One thing I could potentially do is make the whole image bigger first. Say, let's double this to 3600 pixels wide. It was, 1800 wide roughly before? Let's double it. Twice as many pixels, but my halftones are still 4 pixels. That's getting a little better. Okay. Not too bad. But there are some things that are not quite right about this, unfortunately. There are a few ways in which this doesn't quite mimic real halftones, and this is the method that I used up until just a few weeks ago. And I had been on Twitter. I'd posted a little quick run-through tutorial in response to Stephen Smith's request about, now, how are you making these things? So I ran him through my process, and then Rolf Rosing commented, and he said, well, this is, I like this, but only the halftone pattern looks a bit too modern and digital. And so, I thought about that for a little while, and I poked around on the internet, and he was quite right. And I found a tutorial, thanks to his prodding, about how to make amazing halftone effects with Photoshop by David Blattner. And he points out, well, you can do this, what we're doing now, but there's a few things that aren't quite right about it. If you look, for example, instead of being dots that get larger or smaller, sometimes they're dots that just get fainter, and that's not what really happens in halftone printing. These dots don't just change in opacity. You're putting down black ink, and black ink is black ink, and it's black, and these dots need to get larger or smaller. And what Photoshop is doing, these are dots that get larger or smaller, but real halftones, on the other hand, look like this. They're all one color, and as you start to get to more ink density, instead of being circles of ink that get larger, instead there start to be holes in the ink that get larger or smaller as you move towards the second half of the gradient. And so I learned from this tutorial a much better way. It's a little more complicated, but a much more realistic way of producing halftone effects. And you can see on a little side-by-side comparison that I tried out of the old and the new method. And look at how sharp the edges are in the text now. That's what would really happen in a book. What's happening in the sort of simpler, quick method, it's making these little dots fade off near the edges, and that's not quite what would really happen. Halftone screens don't fade out. Somebody who's setting these halftones up in a press will say, well, let's do some printing in the area of the text or in the area of the line or the dot, and let's not print any dots beyond that at all. So sharp edges exist in books, and we want to still simulate that and kind of get rid of some of this fuzziness. So that's why we have a more complicated method to do this thing. So I'm just going to revert this back to where we were and have a look at what we've got here. And so the first thing I want to do is look at my channels. I'm going to pull this out separately here so that we can see what we're looking at. Photoshop is pointing out that this is built of 4 different image channels. I've got a magenta channel. I've got, some of my text is appearing in here. That's unusual. I thought I set up my text as just made out of black, but it looks like it's appearing in every channel. Let me fix that for a second. I wonder if that had something to do. Oh yes, I'm back in Illustrator now real quick. Selecting one of these texts says built of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and that might have been due to my quick conversion to RGB and back. So let me just revert this to its original document form. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so just looked like I'd made a mistake when I was flipping back and forth between RGB and CMYK. So actually, I'm gonna re-export this thing, and we'll see in just a minute the importance of this. Why it's important to have black made of only, just replace that, made of only one channel. And the reason for that, well, again, we talked about this misalignment thing. So imagine you have a misregistration that, and your type is made of 4 colors. You're going to see all these little halos of some yellow bleeding off the edge of your text, some cyan, some magenta, when you could just print it in one stamp, one color of black. So as registration errors come in, type tends to suffer pretty badly. Anything with thin lines. So generally you want your type to be made only of black ink. So Derek's asking, would exporting as 600 be better than 300 and then upping to 600? Potentially. The level of detail that's going to remain once we convert this thing to halftones, you're probably not going to notice a huge difference. But yes, potentially you could get a small difference. I'd be interested to try that out sometime if you exported really detailed to begin with, rather than what I did and scaled things up instead. But with all the texturing, it probably won't be too noticeable. That's an excellent question, though, and we are going to talk a little bit more about resolution in a minute, because it's going to be something we have to think about and play with in this document. But if I look here at the channels this is broken down into, I've got some cyan ink down here in my water. And my trees have some cyan as well. I've got some magenta, and you notice the magenta, the land is made partly of magenta, and there's a hole for the text. Because it's just doing a little knockout. It's saying, well, black ink's going to go here, so there's definitely no need to put magenta under that, because Photoshop is assuming everything will be perfect and that nothing will ever miss a line, and that black stamp that we put for our text won't ever miss the hole that we left for it and leave a weird white shadow. Yellow, looks like we only get yellow in our trees, and then black. And we got a lot of black ink everywhere. There's some darkening the lakes and the land, and then all of our text. So first off, what we're going to do, I'm going to close some of these other things that we don't need. These older images, some of the rest are things we'll look at in a little bit when we delve into the halftone settings. The way this method works is, first off, I need a second version of this image, because I'm going to need a place to paste my halftones into one at a time, and you'll see what that is in a minute. I'm just going to make a duplicate and call paste here. And I'm going to flatten this down so it's just one layer. So this is where we're going to drop our halftones when they're finished. Now we're going to go back to the original, my close-in map, called close-in because I had two versions of the map. There's a zoomed-out one and a close-in one. And I'm going to go over here to the cyan channel. I'm just going to click on it, and we can see only the cyan. And I'm going to go to Image Mode Bitmap. A bitmap is a way of storing images where the only colors you can have are white or black. Every pixel can be on or off. The bit can be 0 or 1, if you think about it sort of behind the scenes in the way it's stored in the computer. And so it's asking me, if you want me to take this cyan channel, which right now in shades of gray, it's going to be, it's going to ask you, well, how do you want to do that? Because I only have black and white if you want to turn this into a bitmap. And one of the options here is to do a halftone, to make these shades of gray out of different sort of sizes of circles. So I'm going to set this at 300 right now, and we'll talk a little bit more. There's a lot of different settings we're going to go through one at a time once we get our heads around the basics. There are other ways it converts things if you ever want to play around with like diffusion dithers and such, which are like random scatters of dots, but I'm going to say do a halftone screen. And I'm going to set this at 90 and keep that at 75 for now. And we'll talk about these settings once we get our head around the basics. So I'm going to leave this as is now. And I click OK, and it turns that cyan channel into a screen of dots. There's some bigger dots, some little dots. There are some areas where it's just solid cyan ink, so it's kept it pretty solid with a little bit of a ragged edge there just based on where the edges of the dots would have fallen. So this is a cyan halftone. The only thing is I've lost everything else in my map. This is just an image of where the cyan dots should go, which is why I have a copy to paste these into. I'm going to select everything. I'm just going to hit Command A here, Command C to copy that, and I'm going to go over to my paste here, and I'm going to click on my cyan channel, and I'm going to hit Command V to paste in. So I've replaced the old cyan channel in my full color document where nothing is lost yet with the new cyan channel. And it's important that your document be only one layer when you're doing this, because if I had this, I'm just undoing here to get all my layers back. If I tried to go into my cyan channel and paste in, it would say, well, wait a minute, you've got multiple layers. Do you want to replace, which one do you want to replace? I don't know, I don't understand. So definitely got to flatten this whole thing down first before we do it and paste in. So now as I look at this document, I can see those dots starting to come through in cyan. They're not dots anywhere else because we've only done this as a cyan channel, but I can keep doing this. I can just undo where I was on this thing to go back and say, let's do this for the magenta channel. All right, well, let's bitmap here. Let's actually do it black. That's going to stand out a little bit more. Let's do a bitmap here, flatten my layers, output, and we have a halftone. I can copy that, put it in black channel, and now it's starting to come together. It's starting to look like it's made of dots. But there are some problems here. The first one is that if I zoom in, my dots are pretty tiny and they don't really look quite like dots. And that has to do with the resolution. This is a raster image. It's just a picture in Photoshop. I'm simulating what dots would look like on paper. I need to think about, can I make the dots, I can't make them any finer. Anytime I want to make the dots finer, they're going to be less than 1 pixel. I could make them bigger potentially, and that's where the setting comes in for our lines per inch. I'm going to undo this here, and we're going to go back to our mode, and we're going to say bitmap. I got to select a channel here. Bitmap. If you notice, one of the things it asks me here, frequency, how many lines per inch, or lines per centimeter if you'd like to mess around with that. And this is printing terminology of, well, how many lines of dots would you like per inch? So, here I've got some full color, some just continuous tone ramps here, and you can see what they look like when half-toned. And if I have fewer lines per inch, that means each dot is larger. If I have 25 lines per inch, then each dot is a 25th of an inch. If I have 50 though, it's a 50th of an inch, so it's smaller. So as I change my lines per inch, the dots on average get finer. And if I make them bigger, they're more noticeable. And that actually comes into play in some of these images that I showed earlier at the beginning in my portfolio. So this image here is at a different lines per inch than this one up here. I don't know how well this comes through in the video, but this one has a finer halftone. You can notice it much less, whereas this one has bigger, bulkier dots, and probably bigger than you'd necessarily really see in real life in a book. But I wanted them to stand out, and I was playing around with dot sizes and putting this up on the internet, and maybe someone's on a small screen. So I really wanted to say, like, look, no, this is an old-looking thing. So I made those bigger. So that's an option. I can play around with the lines per inch here, and if I go back to this thing and say, let's halftone this bitmap, and if I drop this to 30 lines per inch, now those dots are a lot larger. Now it's going to be perhaps a little bit problematically large, but this is where I control that. There's another factor at play here, though, that we have to play with at the same time, which is how big is our document in pixels? Because one of the things that I'm running into in these is that it wants to make small dots, certain number of inches or certain fractions of an inch in size, but there's just not enough pixels to draw them because the image itself is lower resolution. So that's another setting I could play with, and that's kind of the same as we did before. I could just say, well, image size, and make this larger, and then I would potentially, my dots would be made of more pixels. But it doesn't mean that your dots are any proportionately larger necessarily. So if you look at these dots, 25 lines per inch dots. Here are 25 lines per inch dots at a 600 dpi document, and here they are at a 300 dpi document. The dots are the same. If I zoom way out to the whole document on each one, right, the dots are the same between them in terms of how big they are related to the size of the document. But if I zoom in real close on the 300 dpi and the faintest dots, and at the 600 dpi and the faintest dots, right, you can see in the 300 dpi they're made of fewer pixels, just because this document happens to be made of more pixels per inch. So that's a sort of confounding factor you have to play around with. You can make your dots have a more sort of refined, built of more pixels appearance, but their actual size is controlled by the lines per inch. Because what Photoshop is actually doing is any document you have has some resolution of the number of pixels that an inch represents, and then when you say do 25 lines per inch, it's going to say, well, okay, or let's say you're going to do 30 lines per inch. That's mathematically easier. Well, 30 lines per inch, there's 300 pixels per inch in this image, so I have 30 pixels to make the line of dots with. That's going to be its size. So it's doing a little calculation there. So I could play around with these settings and say, like, let's make the document bigger. Scale it up a little bit, and then when I do my, bitmap here, flatten my layers here, 600 dpi, and I'll go back, I think I had 90 lines per inch in the first one that I did. And so now those dots are made of a few more pixels versus over here where those black dots are made of just 1 or 2. So this is a parameter to play around with. Definitely worth thinking about. And I've started to do things kind of in the range of 60 to 80 lines per inch on a document that's, you know, somewhere in the 600 dpi range. But it's kind of trial and error, messing around to get things the way you like. So that's our dot size we have to play around with. The other thing is, notice the black dots are stepping on the blue dots, or the blue dots are stepping on the black dots. Actually, I think cyan is painted first. It'd be nice if I were able to see them both at once, because that's kind of how halftone printing usually works. I don't want one set of colors to totally obscure the other, because that doesn't lead to the sort of the right color balance and this appearing the right shade of blue. And for that, we want to mess around with our screen angle. And here again, I'm going to turn to the helpful diagrams at Wikipedia. And see, there's little dots here, just showing it comes out of this thing. But you print all of the different dot grids at different angles to each other in typical CMYK offset printing. And different people use different screen angles for different purposes. And this one in the upper left, as far as I understand, is sort of your default common angle. The things that people are trying to avoid with this is dots, you know, stepping on each other entirely, and, you know, something getting obscured, but also trying to avoid weird, you know, moire patterns that could potentially happen as screens, especially if they just slightly misaligned from each other, could make some unfortunate optical patterns. So we put them at angles. And these are traditional, except in Photoshop, the way that angles are measured is different. So Photoshop measures its angles from the from this vertical axis here. So the 75 in printer's angle is actually 15 in Photoshop angle. So I do have to do a little conversion. 45 is still 45. You know, 90 becomes 0, but a 90-degree grid of dots and a 0-degree grid of dots are the same thing. And so this is a parameter that we can play around with. And I, you know, put together a little example here of our dot grids. You know, 90 degrees, sort of straight rectilinear, 75 degrees, which also causes that fun optical illusion with things at angles. These are perfectly straight lines. You know, if I do a little selector here, you can see perfectly straight lines, but kind of fools our brain. And then 45-degree dots. So when we go in to set, if I undo this here, our bitmap on our channel here, go back to black. It's also asking, what is your output resolution? It will resize things for you on the fly. I prefer to do it in the image size panel, but it will resize for you in the bitmap dialog. And here it's asking, what is my screen angle? So I could set this at, you know, 45 for black. And now copy and paste that in to replace my old black channel. Because this document, I was like, oh, I pasted this in, why doesn't it line up? Because this document is half the size, because I resized things up. So I will image size here. See, this is the good thing about live, because you make mistakes sometimes and people see, and then they feel better about when they make mistakes, because I make lots of mistakes all the time. There we go, I pasted my black dots in there at the correct angle, and these blue dots are a little fuzzy because they got scaled up because I pasted them in before. And now you can see they don't step on each other as much, and they even are starting to get a little bit of that rosette pattern that is what they call it in printing, that you start to see in old printed books. You start to see little circles of dots coming together at the various angles, and that's, you know, you can see here these rosettes from the different screen angles in Wikipedia's example. So that's another parameter to play with when you're setting your halftones. So I would probably, you know, so let's go through this and do a full real thing here. I'm going to say, let's undo this, and I'm going to say, let's do bitmap channel at a time. I like the 600 dpi. I'm going to make the halftones a little bigger, 70 lines per inch, and 75 degrees for cyan, which is 15 degrees in printer's angles. I'm going to copy this, And oh, there's actually one other thing I want to do. Did I remember to do it? I want to turn off all my layers that are black first before I do the cyan and magenta yellow channels, because I mentioned there's these holes there. It would be safer as far as any registration error goes to do overprint on the black, to print the black on top of everything else, on top of this background, rather than leaving a knockout for it. Right? Because if my black channel ends up misaligned, if I were really printing this, then I would see this sort of white halo around the text, and it would be very obvious that it didn't get quite put in the right spot. So instead, I would like to, at the end, put my black on top of everything and actually leave my background colors underneath the text to make sure that even if it shifts, well, you'll never know, because it revealed just more of the background color as the text accidentally got moved around. So this is why you want layers separate. So these black things that I'm leaving knockouts for, if I just turn them off in the layers panel, make it so I can't see them, now when I look at the cyan channel, got a more magenta panel, they're not there anymore. Also, sometimes you may notice if you click on these, you'll see the channel, and then sometimes, if you noticed a moment ago, I was clicking on these and didn't see it, and that's because what I did was, I selected all the channels, clicked magenta, and then I clicked the eyeball icon to turn everything back on, but I'm still actually only affecting the cyan, yellow, magenta, or black channels. And so I need to go back and click on the full CMYK set and then click again, and then it'll go back to just showing you one channel at a time. All right, so I've got my text turned off. Gonna do just a quick, once you get a hang of this, it doesn't take very long. 75 degrees, 70 lines per inch. Looking good. Copy that. Paste this directly into my cyan channel. Go back, undo. Go to my magenta. Bitmap that. And I happen to know, if you check that Wikipedia thing, for example, 75 degrees or 15 in Photoshop angles is a common one for magenta. Paste that in. Shift to my yellow in this. Shift to my undo. Go back to things unflattened. Go to my yellow here. 90-degree angle. And then finally, black. And here I need to turn on my text again. And that's at a 45-degree angle. And there we go, one at a time, paste them all in. Now it looks kind of half-toned, right? It looks a little noisy, perhaps, noisier than you might used to be seeing. And what solves that is just a little bit of blurring. So if I just select, and make sure you have all your channels selected, because otherwise you'll just blur one channel. I just do a little blur, Gaussian blur, not that much, not 91 pixels. I do like, maybe a whole pixel of blur. Yeah. So let's zoom out. That looks a little bit better. I'm just going to undo so you can kind of see and redo the difference that makes. Just a little softer, so that, because there's a couple reasons for that. One, because if I were scanning an old book, probably not going to be super sharp, but also there's dot gain, which is the idea that when you put ink on paper, it doesn't necessarily stay confined to the dot. It might bleed out a little bit. So we're simulating that by just blurring these things a little bit. And that helps a lot, I think. So that's the basic method. One other thing you might want to do to kind of punch this up a little bit is go to one of these channels and move it around a little bit. Remember I said that idea of misalignment, so I'm going to take the yellow channel, and I just got my little move tool here, and I'm just going to, which I can select with V, nudge that around, just little up arrows here. That's probably pretty severe, but yeah, now I've got a little registration error. People love this stuff. It's funny that nowadays cool graphics simulate things that would just indicate you were bad at your job 60 years ago. Sometimes if you were a press operator, well, you should have lined that up a little bit better. Or I've been told that one of the trends in letterpress things, you get your letterpress business cards or wedding invitations or whatever, people like that sort of physical embossed feeling on it. And people who do letterpress printing are trying to push in more, but oftentimes when letterpress was originally one of the ways that everybody made prints, I've been told that was something to be avoided. Like, you wanted to try and just touch the edge of the paper without leaving too much of an impression if you could. And it's not to say that, that's terrible that people do this nowadays. It's just interesting how these things, these imperfections, suddenly become sort of part of the character and charm of the thing that we really like and look for in these older styles. So, you can nudge these channels around, and you can even, turn on the eyeball so you're affecting only one channel and looking at the others. And again, this is pretty severe. You can see that that's looking pretty bad, but I'll just undo that and maybe move the yellow a little bit. So that's kind of fun. One other thing that I do, I see some of you are signing off too, and you can always catch this. Thanks for joining me. I know I'm running over the hour that I usually go, and you'll catch the video hopefully when it gets posted to YouTube, probably in an hour or two. But there's a couple of quick other things that I want to point out for those of you who are still sticking around. And thanks for joining me if you do have to sign off. So I usually like to add just a little bit of random noise to give things a little bit of a texture. So before doing the halftone, I might add a separate layer and add some noise to it. And weird thing about Photoshop is that I can't add noise to an empty layer. I've actually got to fill the layer with something, even though the noise will replace it. So I'm just going to take this blank layer, fill it with a random color, black in this case. And I'm going to go to Filter, Add Noise, and put some random Gaussian noise in there. And I'm going to take this thing and change the blending mode to Soft Light. And you can see what it's doing there. Just muddying up our colors a little bit. This is too strong. I'm going to go tone it down to 30% or so. But it's just modulating the color a little bit. And now if I go through my halftone process, we're going to get a different result. And in this case, I don't want to take the time to go through it all. I have one that I pre-did which has some noise, some of that soft noise added before halftoning on one side and without on the other. On the left side, I'm going to zoom in so you can see the difference more. The left side, you have this nice, perfect, repeating pattern. On the right side, it looks just a little bit different. Maybe not all those dots are perfectly the same size anymore. And I think that's nice. It gives a little bit more organicness to it. And, it can be hard to notice. It's subtle. And that's where you want to be with this, because a lot of the things that we do here and in cartography in general, if we do them right, people don't notice them, even though they are having an effect and making it look better. So I think the noised version looks just a little bit nicer. Let's see, zoom in down here on the water. You can kind of see, the right side is just a little noisier than the left side kind of thing. So hopefully that's coming through with the video compression. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing that I like to do, just throw an old paper texture on top of this thing. So you can just go on Google and find, go back to, there we go, old paper texture. You can find all kinds of free images, and people will sell you ones if you want to pay for them. And, find some old paper backgrounds and something that seems to look right. Some of these look a little too aged for a book from the 1940s. It's probably not going to be this badly off, but some of them are a little bit more subtle. And so if I go back to Photoshop, I've got one that I've already downloaded. So let me quick grab that out of my files here. Where is it? Yes, this one. So just some old paper, and I'm just going to spread this out a little bit so it covers the whole image. Hit OK, and I'm just going to set that to multiply. Turn it on and off, kind of see the difference. Right? It yellows things up a little bit, which you could have done without a paper texture. You could have just yellowed the colors in Photoshop, but it also just adds a little bit of texturing that's very subtle, and there's even a little bit of a darkening along the edge. So maybe the paper's aging more, maybe you scanned it differently, and I can even see, just barely, a little wrinkle right there in the paper. That's kind of nice. Or maybe that's not a wrinkle. Maybe that's just, nope, that's just the edge of the park. Nope, fooled me. Well, finding things that I expected to see but didn't. So yeah, think about adding some textures to this thing that really sort of sells the effect that you're going for. The last thing I'll point out is a setting that exists when you're doing these bitmaps. that I don't think generally needs to be changed, but might be fun to play around with. Halftone screen, notice it asks you what shape do you want, and you've got options here: round, diamond, ellipse, line, square, and cross. And what I did was I went through them all and in advance, and I looked at what they looked like. I'm going to move my channels back out of the way here. Round dots of halftones are kind of the standard. That's what you'd expect. And some of these actually don't look that much different. You know, if I really zoom in and compare round versus ellipse, it doesn't have much of a difference in the effect. Lines definitely do, though. Diamonds kind of look a little more squarish. Squares look very squarish. Crosses, you get some interesting patterns up here where the channels really all coincide with each other. So, you know, if you want to try those, could be interesting, but I'd say probably round is a good default starting point for these things, and I haven't really felt a reason to go much beyond. And that might be something that, you know, if I delved more into the history of printing, were some of these patterns used in certain applications? Maybe. And maybe if I'm making a map that tries to emulate that, maybe it makes sense to use a line or a cross pattern kind of thing. But round is pretty common as far as I'm aware, so that's a good one to kind of default to. And so with that, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. So I'll pause for a second, see if anybody has any other questions you want to ask before we move into our little outro. And if you do like make some halftony things and tweet them out, and if you get a chance to tag me, I'd like to make sure that I see them, because I'm very curious to see what comes of people learning with this kind of thing. Okay, well, so in that case, I want to say a couple of things. First off, thanks for taking the time to join me. Especially, I know some of you are, even though you're cooped up inside, some of you are much busier now with things like family care and, you know, dealing with chaos at your jobs, potentially putting more work on you because now everyone's dissociated from each other. So hope you're doing as well as you can during these times. I also want to take a moment to thank everybody who supports me on Patreon. You know, people's support helps me take time from the other things that I'm doing to make this stuff happen, these sort of extra things. And so thanks for that to all of you who've supported me, and certainly don't feel like you're obliged to do this, but it's a nice encouragement to have. And then finally, if you like cartography live stream things, I want to give a plug for something that's going on next month, which is how to do map stuff, which some of you might have seen me talking about on Twitter. I just thought one day, you know, I like doing these live streams, and what if other people did live streams on the same day? So right now I got 20 odd people who've all signed up for to live stream in what will be April 29th, although depending on if you're on the other side of the international date line west of me in the United States, it will technically be April 30th. If you want to see what's going on with this, I set up a bit.ly, so you can just go bit.ly/map-stuff, and it should take you to this in-progress program, and there's a link here to European diploma. Did I type that wrong? Map. I set this up earlier. Maybe I just typed it wrong. There we go. Yeah. Sorry about that. Something about maps was my blog, and it'll take you get a link there, and you can find out more and how to sign up. I'm probably going to start setting up the actual schedule for everybody in the next day or two. So if you do want to join in and present something, just make sure to jump in real quick on that sign up. And with that, I'll leave you all to the rest of your day. Greetings from Wisconsin. Hope you're doing well. Take care.